Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little darker than our usual lullabies. The complete history of tetanus, the disease that breaks spines. Forget the sanitized hospital scenes and comforting public health slogans. The real story of tetanus is older, grimmer, and woven through mud, stables, battlefields, and the tiny wounds people ignored. The truth is, dropped into that pre-vaccine world, a single puncture or scrape could set off weeks of relentless spasms, and a struggle your body might not win. Survival was often a matter of luck as much as care. Before you get too comfortable, give the video a like and subscribe if you're enjoying it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. It's incredible to see viewers joining in from every corner of the world. Silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let the long-shadowed history of this merciless microbe begin. The first inked observations of that particular cruelty, a mouth that would not open, a neck that would not bend, a body pulled into grotesque arching, come to us from the slow, deliberate hands of ancient physicians, who were also, in their optimism, poets of the body. In the Greco-Roman libraries, the symptoms appear in short clinical strokes and in the same breath as superstition. Jaw sealed like a clamp, limbs locked as if by a rope, a face twisted into what later ears would call the sardonic smile. Hippocratic fragments and the medical commentaries that followed do not give us a single neat diagnosis the way a modern chart does, but they give us the lived detail. Trismus, they call the locked jaw, tonic rigidity, opisthotonus, the backward curvature of the spine, and they give us the language that would survive for centuries, naming the thing by what it did to a person, not by any microscopic cause. Pliny the Elder, with the voluminous eye of a natural historian, supplied a small uncanny image that haunted later readers. A plant found on Sardinia, a laugh that was a death, a grin frozen on a dying face. The term risus sardonicus, the sardonic smile, would become a tidy, terrible capsule for the facial contortions clinicians saw in later centuries. Celsus and Galen offered more clinical attention, wounds that did not heal, a stiffness that seemed to come from within rather than from a visible injury, convulsions that were different from the falling fits and foaming mouths of epilepsy. Aretius of Cappadocia, writing in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, gave the sort of careful clinical portraiture that medical students would read for generations, the progression from localized stiffness to whole-body tension, the sparing of consciousness even as the body convulsed, the terrible reliability with which a wound might presage a systemic catastrophe. These writers worked in the vocabulary of humours and gods. They named the visible fact of muscle tension and then explained it with the theories to hand. Imbalance bile, an angry deity, the presence of poisonous matter introduced by a thorn or spear. Far from the Mediterranean, in the great hospitals and academies of South and East Asia, physician scholars were composing their own catalogues of the same human miseries. The classical Indian compilations, attributed to names like Sushruta and Charaka, and compiled over centuries between the 1st millennium BCE and the early centuries of the Common Era, contain case vignettes and surgical manuals that discuss wounds, gangrene, and convulsive afflictions that later medical historians have read as descriptions compatible with tetanic illness. They recommended surgical cautery for some wounds, careful cleaning for others, and a long folk repertoire of herbal antidotes aimed at what they called poison or vitiated humours. The language differs, doshas rather than humours, vata disturbances rather than phlegm, but the practical concern is the same: how to keep a simple injury from becoming an irreversible collapse of the muscles. In China, the medical classics that stream down to us in the Huangdi Neijing and in later encyclopedias and pharmacopoeias do not categorize disease in the same Western way, yet they notice the same bodily disturbances: a mouth that will not open, a tightness of the sinews, convulsive jitters that rise from the limbs. Chinese physicians explained these as imbalances of qi, invasions of wind, the intrusion of cold into the channels. Treatments were correspondingly different in spirit: acupuncture to move stagnation, moxibustion to warm the channels, decoctions of herbs known to dispel wind and strengthen the sinews, and yet in their faith in procedure and in observation, they share a kinship with the Greco-Roman clinicians. Li Shizhen, the industrious Ming physician who compiled the Bencao Gangmu late in the 16th century, collected and cross-referenced hundreds of remedies and anecdotes. and his gathering together of earlier materials ensured that ancient observations about jaw-locking and convulsive disorders would be accessible to later healers. Across these cultures, two themes recur with almost ritual insistence. First, the symptom complex. Lockjaw, tonic rigidity, opisthotonus, and that sardonic twist is described again and again with a clarity that allows modern readers to recognize tetanus across languages and centuries. Second, the explanation is at first local and moral as much as physical. Disease is punishment, it is the result of poison, it is the disturbance of foundational humours or energies. These are not idle metaphors. They are the best explanatory tools available to practitioners whose instruments are hands and words, and whose logistics are the supply lines of early hospitals. Ointments, cauteries, bandages, poultices. The ways in which ancient healers responded were revealing for their mixture of the practical and the theatrical. A wound in a soldier's thigh might be cleared, the foreign body probed for and then packed with spices and honey to staunch putrefaction, while on the next bed a priest might chant an exorcism over a convulsing man, because the same convulsion could equally plausibly have been read as demonic possession. Honey, wine, vinegar, and wine-soaked bandages appear everywhere. Practical antisepsis by trial and error long before the phrase existed. When a wound was friable or foul, cautery with a red-hot iron was a common recourse, both in India and across Mediterranean surgery. So too was ligature, a crude form of containment meant to stop bleeding and to close a wound against the ingress of further corruptible matter. The logic of these measures was as strategic as it was simple. Reduce the local insult and the systemic response might be avoided. When the records move into the medieval era, the picture thickens. In the monasteries and hospitals of medieval Europe, one still finds that same mixture of ritual and remedy, but the social and administrative frame around treatment changes. Monastic infirmaries and later municipal hospitals became repositories of knowledge and sites of pragmatic care. The School of Salerno, the great medieval Mediterranean hospital and school of medicine, compiled surgical aphorisms that informed lay and learned healers alike. Poultices and plasters, cautery when necessary, and an emphasis on cleanliness of dressing that, while not framed in germ theory, was nonetheless a lesson in logistics. That infection, whatever one called it, could be limited by prompt, organised care. At the same time, religious frameworks dictated many of the contours of treatment. Saints were petitioned, relics were pressed upon the fevered brow. People saw a convulsion and thought of the possession. They saw a mother dying after childbirth and thought of a divine judgment or curse. The Church's influence meant that cure and confession were sometimes inseparable. Exorcism remained a therapeutic route in some cases, especially where convulsions accompanied apparent alterations of the person and where the inability to open the mouth linked the illness to spiritual peril rather than to a wound's contamination. But even where theology dominated meaning, practical measures survived and adapted. Avicenna, in his Canon of Medicine, and Al-Razi, Raises, in his clinical writings, synthesized Greek therapeutics with Islamic innovations. They advocated manageable interventions, wound cleaning with wine, the application of poultices made from plant resins and aromatic substances, and cauterization for persistent suppuration. These learned physicians also pushed for systematic observation, lists of symptoms, courses of disease, and crucially, rules for the care of the sick that could be taught to apprentices. The Arabic translations of Greek texts served as a bridge. When the Latin West returned to Greek learning, the medical corpus was richer for the interchange. At the level of communities, coping meant improvising systems of care. In rural villages, a wound might receive immediate domestic attention, the blade that caused it rinsed in wine or salt, covered with butter or honey, and the patient removed from heavy labour. A surgical guild in a city regulated who could prescribe poultices or perform cautery. The barber surgeons of London, organised and rechartered under Henry VIII in 1540, are a telling example of the institutionalisation of wound care. Barbers trimmed hair and drew blood, surgeons set bones and cauterised wounds, and the regulatory hand of the municipality helped determine who had the authority to touch an infected limb. In such an environment, certain remedies persisted because they fit the institutional and theological frameworks of the day. Others vanished for lack of official sanction. Not every remedy was purely physical. Amulets, charms, and incantations formed a parallel pharmacopoeia that communities relied on when formal medicine was scarce. A mother with a newborn that would not feed because the jaw remained tight might be encouraged to recite a prayer while the midwife applied a poultice of herbs. If the poultice failed, so too might the prayer, but that did not imply a lack of logic, only a scarcity of better options. Where the record-keeping was good, municipal rolls and parish registers noted clusters of jaw-locking deaths after plagues and sieges, after harvests when children were born quickly and dirtily at home, and after battles when many raw wounds lay in the field. Monastic chronicles and city annals sometimes list bouts of trismus among the vernacular causes of mortality. These entries are terse, but they are data for later clinicians and historians to assemble into patterns. Surgery itself in the medieval and early Renaissance period became more courageous and more organised. Guy de Chauliac, writing his Chirurgia Magna in the 14th century, described not only the plasters and cauterizations he had inherited, but the logistics of running a surgical practice in a city with guild rules and an ecclesiastical hierarchy. Wound ligation, the strategic closure of a wound, and the avoidance of leaving necrotic tissue in place were promoted as much by pragmatism as taste. When epidemics of post-traumatic stiffness or of bad obstetric outcomes occurred after sieges and famines, the records of municipal councils sometimes reflect a search for organisational remedies, better supplies for hospitals, more trained attendants, tighter oversight of midwives. All of this was happening at the scale of households and towns, but the step to systematic clinical description took place as Europe entered the early modern world. The 17th century in particular favoured a new attention to the body as a site of observation to be recorded, compared and named. Thomas Sydenham in England, who published his works in the mid-1600s, urged physicians to attend to epidemic regularities and to classify diseases by their course and effect rather than to deploy grand speculative theories alone. Thomas Willis, the Oxford physician whose anatomical and neurological interests were pioneering in the 1660s and 1670s, helped to build the language of neurology. His efforts to describe convulsive and tonic states pushed clinicians to separate diseases that might previously have been folded into a single category. By the end of the 17th century, physicians were using older Greek words with new precision. Trismus for the localized jaw spasm, and tetanos, from the Greek tetanus, tension rooted in tenein, to stretch, to name the condition that produced sustained, painful muscular tightening across the body. This was not merely a linguistic exercise. Hospitals in Paris, London, and Vienna were becoming sites of comparative clinical practice. Post-mortem anatomy, itself increasingly accepted, allowed physicians to compare cases. What did a wound look like in someone who had become rigid compared to a wound in someone who healed? Giovanni Battista Morgagni, the Italian anatomist whose great work in the mid-18th century linked clinical symptoms with findings from autopsy, promoted the idea that careful observation of living patients, when paired with dissection, could yield causal knowledge. Surgeons such as John Hunter in Britain insisted on systematic recording of outcomes, which meant that wound care began to look like an organised problem of logistics: how to clean, how to close, how to limit disease spread in a hospital ward. During the 18th century, the logic of smell broadened. Armies provided a grim but invaluable laboratory for medical observation. Armies furnished many wounds, and military surgeons were adept at compiling case reports and discussing what worked on a large scale. Military hospitals in the British Empire and in French and Dutch colonial worlds accumulated regimental returns, lists of wounds and their fates that were later read by civilian physicians. The East India Company's medical service recorded not merely fever and dysentery, but also the peculiarities of wound infections encountered among soldiers and civilians in tropical soils. Colonial practitioners, observing higher rates of post-traumatic stiffness in some regions, started to suspect environmental contributors such as certain soils, farm animals, and particular forms of contamination. Obstetrics produced a particularly painful institutional lesson that catalysed change. The 18th and early 19th centuries saw the rise of lying in hospitals and birthing rooms for an increasing urban population. The logic was social as much as medical. Poor women especially sought care in institutions that promised more than a midwife's cottage. What doctors in those institutions noticed, and what alarmed them, was that postpartum infections became visible as patterns. Mothers who had undergone certain kinds of instrumentation, or whose attendants used unboiled tools and dressings, sometimes developed the severe convulsive and ultimately fatal conditions we now categorize under puerperal sepsis and, in part of the clinical spectrum, tetanus. The problem was epidemiological as much as pathological, and the response began to take the character of public health, closer supervision of midwifery, the regulation of instruments, and the development of protocols for cleaning and dressing wounds. Medical journals too began to standardise the reporting of cases. The Lancet, founded in 1823, along with other contemporary periodicals, offered forums where case series could be debated and aggregated. Physicians wrote to each other across empires. A surgeon in Madras might send a letter to London detailing a number of cases of lockjaw following spear wounds among the local peasantry, and that letter might feed into a surgeon's manual or hospital protocol years later. The implications were simple but profound. The collection of many small clinical stories could produce a pattern. The pattern for tetanus suggested an association with wounds that either were inoculated by contaminated soil or that were treated with practices leaving necrotic material in place. For childbirth-related cases, the raw umbilical stump and the use of unsterile dressings were common elements. Clinicians in this phase also sharpened their differential diagnosis. Tetanus needed to be differentiated from epilepsy, from rabies, and from forms of hysteria and convulsive varnish that had theological and psychiatric valences. Here the bedside provided the observation that mattered. In tetanus, consciousness is typically retained. The episodes are tonic and sustained rather than the clonic jerks of epilepsy, and the triggers are often local, a wound, an instrumented birth, rather than spontaneous. Such distinctions were essential for strategy. If tetanus was not epilepsy, sedatives would not be sufficient. If it was connected to wounds, then better wound logistics might reduce incidence. The word trismus remained useful because it described a hallmark sign, and tetanus as a nosological label gave clinicians a focus for both treatment and prevention. Therapeutically, the early modern and late modern practitioners oscillated between palliation and prevention. For immediate management, opiates and muscle relaxants, bromides in the 19th century, heavy opiates earlier, were deployed to ease suffering and try to limit spasm. But it was the preventive measure that taxed administrators. Could one change practices at scale? The answer was slowly, sometimes tragically, yes. Military surgeons pushed for better field dressing protocols. Municipal authorities began to demand sterilised instruments in certain hospital settings. Maternity institutions in some cities required registration of midwives and rules about instrument care. These were early, tentative forms of public health regulation, aimed less at metaphysical causes than at the logistics of avoiding contamination. The century closed with a new, noisier confidence in the value of careful clinical surveillance and the potential of laboratory science. By the second half of the 19th century, clinical case series, hospital ledgers, and colonial returns had produced a body of observational work that made the problem appear tractable to the emerging bacteriologists and physiologists. The language that had been slowly refined since the Hippocratic fragments, trismus, tetanus, opisthotonus, and rhizus sardonicus, now had the pragmatic function of delineating the disease for laboratory study. Where ancient physicians had invoked gods and humours, and medieval healers had balanced prayer with poultice and cautery, modern physicians were assembling the data necessary to ask a new question. Could a specific, reproducible agent be responsible? And if so, how might it be prevented at the scale of a city, an army, or a colony? In that slow transition from anecdote to system, the work of clinicians and of logistics people, the hospital administrators, the regimental surgeons, the compilers of public health returns, was decisive. They turned cases into patterns and patterns into policy. They taught midwives to clean instruments, pressured city councils to provide boiling water in infirmaries, and argued for guild oversight. They fed the epidemiological data that would interest laboratory investigators, and they created the institutional levers that would later make large-scale prevention possible. It is a quiet story of accumulation rather than drama. Many small domestic and municipal decisions, repeated over decades, that slowly changed the environment in which a bacterium could act. If there is dark humour in this history, it comes from the repetitive ingenuity of human beings. The same societies that penned hymns of supplication also invented the standardised dressing. They blamed the gods and then sterilised the scalpel. They named the contorted smile after a Sardinian herb and later would name the condition after the muscle tension that characterised it. The arc from the bower of an ancient physician's hut, through the cramped wards of medieval hospitals into the regimented wards of 19th century infirmaries, is an arc of increasing attention to scale. from the household to the hospital to the state's responsibility for preventing the conditions in which the disease flourished. So the story continues. The ancients give us the sharp, unforgettable images, a jaw like a vice, a body arched in a pain that is also a posture of defense, and the medieval world shows us how communities stitched ritual and remedy together when causes were obscure. The early modern era refines language and method and, very importantly, gathers the records that would be necessary to press the scientific case. Each period contributes to a layered understanding. The descriptive certainty of the ancients, the practical cunning of medieval caregivers, the organizational and nosological discipline of modern clinicians. These are the tools, humble and cumulative, that transform tetanus from a nameless terror into a problem that could be measured, managed, and eventually, in the laboratories and public health offices of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cured and prevented in ways earlier healers could scarcely have imagined. In the quiet of those long centuries, people learned to recognize a pattern, to transmit the rulebook for care, and to build the logistical scaffolding without which no medical revolution can be sustained. The body that once seemed to be contorted by caprice thus became intelligible. The disease that broke spines was finally being understood as something that communities could, if they chose and organised, keep at bay. In the hush of late 19th century laboratories, where the lamps threw long ovals of light across benches stained with the slow poetry of experiments, the outline of a very small enemy began at last to resolve. Europe was full then of men and institutions that had turned the microscope into a confessional. Pasteur's workshops in Paris, Robert Koch's tidy Berlin rooms, the itinerant Japanese bacteriologist Shibasaburo Kitasato working in Koch's shadow. These places smelled of broth, of carbolic acid, and the warm, damp fur of incubators. It was in that climate of methodical curiosity and rivalry that the organism we now call Clostridium tetani first stepped forward into medical view. In Germany in 1884, Arthur Nicolaier reported bacilli in the wounds of tetanus victims. He had seen the slender, terminally spore-bearing rods in material from infected tissue and in soil, and his notes, careful and clinical, suggested an anaerobic life that tolerated heat and scorned air. Nicolaier's name appears in the early pages of the story as the first hand to point a microscope at the culprit, but the tale only quickened when others took up the glass and the flame. The decisive work came a few years later. In 1889, Kitasato Shibasaburo, newly arrived in Berlin and working in the bustling microbe world of Koch's laboratory, managed what had hitherto been maddeningly difficult. He isolated and cultivated the anaerobic bacillus from clinical material, grew it in conditions where oxygen could not interfere, and found that the sterile filtrate of his cultures could produce, when injected into experimental animals, all the grim signs of the human disease. This was a small, clean demonstration with enormous consequences. It made plain that tetanus could be produced by something soluble, something diffusible, a poison, a toxin, rather than only by the physical spread of bacteria into the brain itself. The bacterium could be present in the wound, and yet the violence of lockjaw and arching back might be enacted by a molecular emissary. Kitasato's experiments were meticulous. He used the anaerobic techniques that Koch's school had perfected. He separated organisms from broth by filtration, and then injected that filtrate into rabbits and guinea pigs, and he watched, with the same professional detachment with which surgeons note a pulse, for the onset of trismus and the rigid spasms that clinched the diagnosis. The toxin hypothesis had been given a laboratory voice. When a laboratory begins to speak in such plain terms, clinicians listen. If a needle wound or a farmer's puncture could incubate bacteria that in turn produced a circulating poison, then the clinical logic shifted from merely excising dead tissue and hoping to stave off infection to catching the poison while it still floated free in the blood. That sharper, almost surgical idea, neutralize the toxin before it finds the nerve, moved rapidly from thought into practice. Kitasato and his contemporaries showed that animals deliberately immunized against that culture filtrate developed serum that could neutralize the poison. Serum from one creature could protect another. That atomized a revolutionary notion into therapeutics. Passive immunity, the gift of antibodies from one animal to another, could block disease if given in time. Emil von Behring in Germany, working in the same ferment of ideas that had produced diphtheria antitoxin, soon joined the handful of pioneers who turned laboratory curiosity into field medicine. For his work in serum therapy, he would receive a Nobel Prize in 1901. Paul Ehrlich, another German voice in this chapter, had brought a conceptual language, side chain theory, the idea of specific binding that helped turn antitoxins into quantifiable goods, into something that could be measured and standardized and therefore transported and rationed. The practical consequences were as prosaic as they were profound. Large animals, horses most commonly, were used as living factories of immunity. A measured regimen of inactivated toxin would be given to a horse to stimulate its defences without killing it. After a schedule of increasing exposure, the animal's blood would contain heavy concentrations of neutralising antibodies. Veterinary yards became laboratories in their own right. Horses stood still in stalls, their necks bared to the practised hands of technicians who drew off the hyperimmune serum, which was then separated, fractionated and bottled. The image is oddly domestic, stables and stethoscopes, but the scale was industrial and the stakes were national. Serum therapy, rendered operational by the likes of Behring and by Pasteur's institution in Paris and other centres across Europe, meant that hospitals and military surgeons could offer a prophylactic dose to a wounded man whose tetanus status was uncertain. It meant that the immediate period after a puncture became a window of rescue rather than pure dread. The logistics of those early antitoxin campaigns are important. They tell a story about how science meets supply chains. Producing enough serum to protect a population required horses, stablemen, skilled vets, tall cold rooms, syringes, and a distribution network that stretched from city laboratories to village clinics. It also surfaced problems. Heterologous proteins could provoke allergic reactions in human recipients. Serum sickness, fever, rash, joint pains was a real cost of this therapy. Still, the calculation between a prophylactic dose and the often fatal course of untreated tetanus was a practical sort of morality. During wars and epidemics, the choice was obvious, and the allocation of horse serum became a matter of public health logistics. By the time the first global conflicts of the 20th century began to take victims, armies were already learning how to push antitoxin into field hospitals, how to keep barrels of serum on ice during transport, how to train medics to recognize the critical window in which neutralization could prevent toxin from reaching the central nervous system. The laboratory evidence that had compelled clinicians to adopt antitoxin therapy was persuasive. Beyond simple demonstration that filtrates could induce disease, experimenters showed that once toxin was bound within nerves, the serum was ineffective. Only the circulating, unbound toxin could be neutralized by antibodies. That single mechanistic point, if the toxin had already boarded the neurons, you could not pry it off, explained why timing mattered. It also explained a paradox that had puzzled surgeons for generations. Sometimes a patient with a deeply contaminated wound would not develop tetanus, while another with a superficial nick would fall ill. In the latter case, the toxin may have been produced in a microenvironment that favoured its release and absorption, or the host's defences may have been insufficient to mop it up before neuronal uptake. The biological subtlety demanded public health temperance. Better to give antitoxin and avoid the risk than to wait and mourn. The idea of a soluble poison, a molecular saboteur, changed more than treatment. It altered imagination. Where earlier medical writers invoked miasmas, or the direct spread of organisms through tissues into the spinal cord, the new model placed emphasis on toxins as agents of distant damage. Clinicians began to chart the hours and days after a wound with a new script, inspect the wound, debride dead tissue, watch the incubation clock, and, if indicated, inject antitoxin. This was a regimen born of microscopes and horse stables, of German and French laboratories, of a new confidence in the capacity to intervene in what had seemed to be fate. If Chapter 4 closes with the microbe identified and the concept of antitoxin therapy born, the next movement of the story moves inward, down nerve trunks and across synapses, to the very mechanism by which the toxin exerts its tyranny. The toxin came to be named Tetanus pasmin, the spasm-bringing poison, and it is a small molecular machine with a cruel choreography. Structurally, it is a two-chain protein, cleaved into a heavy chain and a light chain joined by a disulfide bond. The heavy chain is the locksmith, the light chain the blade. The heavy chain recognizes and binds specific molecules on the surface of motor neuron terminals, gangliosides among them, and mediates uptake. The toxin is taken into vesicles by endocytosis, and when the vesicle acidifies, the heavy chain forms a pore, a narrow corridor through which the light chain passes, its disulfide bond reduced, its catalytic pocket free to perform its dark work. Once inside the neuron's cytoplasm, the light chain proves itself a protease with very particular tastes. It cleaves synaptic vesicle proteins that are the heart of neurotransmitter exocytosis, chiefly synaptobrevin, also known as VAMP, a component of the snare machinery that threads vesicle to membrane and allows release of neurotransmitter. The snare complex is like a tiny rope and pulley. When it is severed, the vesicle cannot deliver its contents. In the case of tetanospasmin, the neurons most grievously affected are the inhibitory interneurons in the spinal cord and brainstem, cells that normally release glycine and gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, to restrain motor neurons. The toxin removes the brakes. The excitatory drive is left unchecked. Muscles contract, they do not let go. There is a precise and haunting elegance to this molecular narrative. Bacteria in a dark wound produce a protein that steals a cell's ability to silence itself. The toxin does not need to take up residence in the brain to wreak havoc. It rides the axons of motor neurons in a slow retrograde transit toward the spinal cord and brainstem, a journey along the microtubule tracks fueled by dynin motors. Mid-20th century neuroanatomists, through nerve ligation experiments and tracer studies, began to map this reverse voyage, and to show, with a stubborn clarity, that tetanospasmin goes where motor neurons lead it. In the laboratories of Europe and later in the United States, researchers traced the protein's movement with labelled markers. They watched it accumulate in spinal interneuron territories. They watched, finally, the functional consequence, the loss of inhibitory neurotransmitter release, manifest in the living animal as the very spasms clinicians had long described. The comparison to botulism is illuminating. Botulinum neurotoxins and tetanospasmin are cousins in the family of clostridial neurotoxins, similar in architecture and proteolytic prowess but different in destination. Botulinum toxin acts predominantly at the neuromuscular junction, cleaving snare proteins in the motor terminal itself and producing flaccid, descending paralysis. Tetanospasmin, in contrast, travels home along nerves to the central circuits that hold our reflexes in balance and shuts down inhibition. One knocks out the accelerator, the other cuts the brakes. Both are exquisitely specific, both are surprisingly elegant in their pathology. Both were subjects of intense biochemical scrutiny in the latter half of the 20th century as molecular neuroscientists like Marco Schiavo, Francesca Rossetto, and Cesare Montecucco in Italy and elsewhere decoded the very proteolytic cuts that turned neurons into silent witnesses. The molecular intimacy of tetanospasmin explains clinical reality. When the toxin cleaves synaptobrevin in inhibitory interneurons, the resulting disinhibition manifests palpably. The jaw locks, the face pulls into the sardonic grimace called risus sardonicus, and the trunk arches into opisthotonus with a kind of terrible silent deliberation. If one wants to translate the microscopic into the human register, imagine a city whose traffic lights all fail at once, and whose ambulances keep blaring uselessly. Without the stops and slowdowns, the whole system becomes chaotic. The autonomic centres can be affected too. When the toxin reaches the brainstem nuclei that help regulate heart rate and the blood pressure, the patient may experience swings of hypertension and tachycardia, bouts of profuse sweating, and thermoregulatory disarray. Tetanus is thus both a motor disease and, in severe forms, an autonomic storm. The peculiar permanence of the toxin's action is another lesson of molecular biology with clinical weight. The proteolytic cut is not easily reversed. The neuron must synthesize new snare proteins or rely on axonal sprouting to form functional terminals anew. Recovery, when it comes, is measured not in days but in weeks and months, as synaptic machinery is painstakingly rebuilt. That explains the long convalescence recorded in hospitals long before modern ventilation and muscle relaxant pharmacology could shorten the time a patient spent in care. Understanding the toxin's mechanism also clarified the limits of antitoxin therapy. Antibodies can neutralize only toxin that remains in the circulation or extracellular space. Once the molecule has entered a nerve terminal and the light chain has been released into cytosol, antibodies cannot reach it. That is why early prophylactic administration is decisive, while late administration is often palliative rather than curative. The insight was not merely mechanistic but moral in its implications. Prevention, not heroics, saves a spine. This brings us to the human face of the illness, to the sequence that doctors have described for more than a century, and that has fed both dread and metaphor. The classic progression begins with an incubation period. typically measured in days or a few weeks after a wound, during which the bacterium multiplies and secretes its toxin. A small puncture wound, imagine the sting of a nail through a boot sole, has always loomed so large in historical narratives for the very reason that it fosters the low-oxygen niche Clostridium prefers. Then comes trismus. The jaw muscles seize first, and the patient finds it increasingly difficult to open the mouth. The jaw is the visible alarm for a disease that will soon speak with the muscles of the torso and limbs. Next, the face takes on the macabre smile that medical writers call risus sardonicus, a contraction of the facial muscles that looks in human terms almost grotesque, but in pathological terms is only a faithful illustration of the toxin's assault on brainstem inhibitory circuits. Generalized rigidity follows, and then the paroxysmal spasms, sudden forceful contractions brought on by noise, touch, or spontaneous misfiring. The back may arch in a pisthottonus until the head and heels almost meet. Breathing becomes a battle as the chest wall and diaphragm stiffen, and the heart runs on a treadmill of autonomic instability. In the absence of ventilatory support and expert care, mortality in generalized tetanus was once high. In the late 19th century and the early decades of the 20th, before antitoxin and before widespread active immunization, hospitals recorded fatality rates that often exceeded half of those afflicted. For neonates, the result was frequently unavoidable. It is here that the lurid metaphor, the disease that breaks spines, arises, half-truth and hyperbole braided together. In the annals of clinical and forensic medicine, there are, indeed, sporadic reports of structural injury incurred during violent tetanic spasms, compression fractures of thoracic vertebrae, isolated rib fractures, even dislocations. Surgeons and pathologists who kept meticulous records in London, Paris and Berlin published autopsy series that sometimes noted fractured vertebral bodies in patients who had suffered prolonged uncontrolled spasms. Such reports were dramatic enough to feed a fearful popular imagination, and they survive in medical literature as cautionary footnotes. The physics, after all, admits the possibility. Tetanic contraction of the paraspinal muscles can generate enormous axial forces across vertebrae, and in an older or osteoporotic skeleton, or in the sustained paroxysms of severe disease, a fracture is a plausible mechanical outcome. But it is rare. Bones do not typically shatter as a central feature of tetanus. The spine bends and groans under the muscle's insistence, and in a few unlucky or weakened bodies, structural failure occurs. The phrase break spines is poetic and alarmist in equal measure, a cautionary tale, not the rule. Historical case notes illustrate the variability that hunger for context often misses. A soldier with a shrapnel wound in the groin in Chapter 16 could develop tetanus with a short incubation and rapid generalized spasms if no antitoxin or wound care had been promptly available. A child in rural India in the 1920s who had an uncleanly cut umbilical cord might develop neonatal tetanus within days, a disease with its own catastrophic and intimate economy of death. A factory worker in an English industrial town with a small nail puncture might be saved by an early dose of antitoxin and proper debridement. Cephalic tetanus, where cranial nerves are primarily involved, often after head wounds or ear infections, was observed to have a particularly grim prognosis. Localized tetanus, in which only muscles near the wound become rigid, appeared sporadically and sometimes resolved without progression. Age, the nature of the wound, and the speed and quality of care all shaped outcome. Autopsy reports from the late 19th century contributed a paradoxical clarity. Despite the ferocity of clinical symptoms, investigators often found little in the way of inflammatory destruction within the central nervous system that would explain such paralysis had bacterial invasion been the cause. There would be rigid muscles, sometimes necrotic tissue at the wound, and occasionally fractured bone, but the spinal cord itself bore no consistent suppurative lesion. That absence of gross central inflammation was another line of evidence in favour of the toxin hypothesis, and made the case for serum therapy and later active vaccination all the more compelling. The social and logistical dimensions of tetanus control are inseparable from the disease's biology. Where hospitals had access to antitoxin, where surgeons could irrigate and debride wounds, where vaccination campaigns reached mothers and infants, the incidence and mortality of tetanus fell. Where public health failed, tetanus continued to exact a heavy toll. In the early 20th century, with the slim but real benefit of antitoxin, campaigners and public health officials turned to the even more promising idea of active immunization. In the 1920s, Gaston Ramon at the Pasteur Institute in Paris showed that formaldehyde inactivated toxin, what would come to be called a toxoid, could safely elicit protective immunity. That innovation moved the field beyond passive transfers and into prevention that could be scaled through routine vaccination programs, a prophylactic shield across populations rather than a reactive therapy for individuals. Even as vaccines pushed tetanus back in industrialized nations, the clinical spectrum remained a subject of fascination and dread in places where prevention lagged. Neonatal tetanus, tied to traditional birthing practices and unimmunized mothers, remained particularly tragic throughout the 20th century until concerted global vaccination efforts dramatically reduced its incidence. The image of the small gasping infant with a clenched jaw was one that public health campaigns hoped, and often succeeded, to banish. And this rescue too was made possible by the union of bench and policy, the laboratory's elucidation of a toxin, the veterinarian's art in raising antitoxin, the clinician's willingness to adopt serum therapy, and later, the immunologist's invention of the toxoid. There are ironies that a nightly narration might find almost comic if they did not concern flesh. A disease named for a violent breaking, the one that snaps the spine, turns out to be, in essence, an argument about neurotransmitters and the absence of inhibition. A tiny protease, shuttled along an axon, quietly slips into a cell and severs a single protein, and yet the body answers with movements so strong that bone can be bent in its wake. Science reduced the drama, and in doing so it gave practitioners a new repertoire of defences. Antitoxin could neutralise the circulating danger. Wound care could prevent the little anaerobe from luxuriating. The toxoid could teach immune systems to remember. Recovery, when it arrives slowly as neurons rebuild their scaffolding, as months of quiet convalescence replace the frantic hours at the bedside. This is not a story of unalloyed triumph. It is also a story about access and scale. The laboratories of Berlin and Paris could not protect every hand that stepped on a nail. Horses' serum could not be produced in equal measure for every village. But the arc from Nicolaer's first microscope observation in Germany in 1884 to Kitasato's experiments in 1889, to Behring's clinical application, to Ramon's toxoid in the 1920s, maps a trajectory in which understanding the microbe and the molecule reshaped clinical strategy and public health logistics. And the consequence is tangible. Tetanus moved from a feared inevitability to a largely preventable scourge when societies chose the infrastructure, vaccines, cold chains, trained personnel, required to translate bench discoveries into everyday protection. When the lights dim and one lets the mind follow the long hush of a laboratory corridor, it is odd and consoling to think that what once seemed like a mythic force breaking bodies was, in truth, a protease with a very particular talent. A blade that wanted synaptobreven. The bones sometimes bore the cost, but the real battle was microscopic. The triumphs against tetanus have always been as much about systems, stables and serums, laboratories and logistics, mothers and clinics, as about the swift clarity of a well-controlled experiment. History is patient in its judgments. It rewards those who notice that prevention is not only a policy, but a series of small, persistent acts of science made available to a public. For the tide that carries tetanospasmin from a wound into a spinal cord, there is now a countercurrent. Vaccine, antitoxin, clean hands, and the steady work of public health. The story of tetanus, of lockjaw and Rhesus sardonicus and the occasional broken spine, is therefore not a tale of a monster vanquished by one blade. It is the long, careful choreography of knowledge, provision, and the quiet human will to keep the lights on in the stables where immunity is raised and to make sure the serum reaches the bedside before the train departs. The old operating theatres were cathedrals of noise and clatter, lit by gas and filled with the metallic tang of iron, blood, sweat, and the faintly sweet dust of sawdust on the floor. Surgeons worked with hands that had cut through flesh and then turned to tie an umbilical cord, to sew up a wound, to saw a limb, and no one in those rooms thought twice about rinsing the instruments between cases or scrubbing the hands to an antiseptic standard that we would now call rudimentary. In such places, the spores of Clostridium tetani, invisible, patient, waiting in soil and on rusted nails, found easy entrances into devitalized tissue and postoperative tetanus was a familiar terror. What began with a puncture or a careless cut sometimes ended in the rigid, sardonic smile of lockjaw. The numbers were not always recorded carefully, but the pattern was unmistakable. Hospitals that promised healing too often became incubators for deadly complications, and the surgeon's scalpel could make a wound that invited a silent assassin. There were voices against that neglect. In Vienna in 1847, Ignaz Semmelweis moved quietly among two maternity wards and kept a ledger. The doctor's ward, where anatomy students and obstetricians fresh from autopsies delivered babies, had a grimly higher death rate from puerperal fever than the midwives' ward. Semmelweis made an unsettling, stubborn observation and a disorienting suggestion: wash the hands. He introduced chlorinated lime for scrubbing when returning from the dissecting room, and the mortality figures fell so sharply that the change could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. He wrote, lectured, begged for change. They mocked him, they exiled him. He died in 1865, a bitter, tragic figure whose hands, which had been right, were not allowed to steady the profession. His insight, however, was a stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples would reach many shores. The louder, more widely accepted ripple came from Joseph Lister, a surgeon in Glasgow who in 1807 published a practical manifesto of a new idea in the Lancet: antiseptic surgery. Lister had read Pasteur's essays on fermentation and the role of invisible organisms in spoiling milk and souring wine, and he saw the connection between microscopic life and the suppurations he had watched consume so many patients. He began to spray carbolic acid, phenolsins, over wounds, instruments, and dressings, and to soak dressings in it. It was an ugly chemical that stung and smelled, but when Lister applied it to fractures and amputations, the wounds healed more cleanly, and fewer patients died of so-called hospital gangrene. To list the whole of play-by-play change would be to collapse decades into a single paragraph. What is important is the pattern. A named antiseptic was applied, microbial life was thought of as causal rather than cosmological, and for the first time there was a method aimed at the unseen enemy. That method did not sweep like a tidal wave. The spread of germ theory and its surgical application was uneven, partisan, and often petty. Louis Pasteur in France demonstrated the idea that life too small to see could overturn assumptions about disease. Robert Koch in Germany turned the microscope into a tool of legal proof, isolating Bacillus anthracis in 1876 and setting the scientific standard that a specific organism could be tied to a specific disease. Yet between laboratory bench and operating table lay temperaments and traditions. Some French and continental surgeons, proud of centuries of technique and tacit knowledge, looked upon Listerian chemistry as theatrical, a fog of carbolic spray that could not be applied to the realities of their theatres. Others, particularly in Britain, took Lister's practice to heart and began to see post-operative complications subside. The bacteriological pieces that mattered for tetanus fell into place at the end of the century. In 1889, Shibasaburo Kitasato, working in Robert Koch's laboratory in Berlin, isolated the bacterium we now call Clostridium tetani and described its terrible neurotoxin. For the first time, the enemy had a name and a mechanism. A spore-forming anaerobic rod that thrived in oxygen-poor pockets of dead tissue and released a neurotoxin that bound irreversibly to motor neurons, producing inexorable spasms. This was not mere theory. It explained why a soiled nail in a man's foot could produce the same fate as contaminated sutures in someone who had just undergone surgery. With that knowledge, surgeons and public health officials finally had an intellectual map of the terrain they were trying to defend. Practice, however, moves slowly. Antisepsis, the attempt to kill microbes chemically in the wound and environment, came first and did a tremendous amount of good. Lister's carbolic dressings reduced infection where they were correctly used. But there were problems. The chemical could be toxic to tissues and painful to patients, and the strategy depended on heroic, sometimes ritualistic applications. Enter a second phase, asepsis, avoiding contamination altogether. Inventive surgeons adopted cleaner technique not by spraying a chemical cloud, but by ensuring that instruments, drapes, gloves, and the air around an open wound were as free of microbes as could be achieved. Men like Ernst von Bergmann in Germany advocated steam sterilization of instruments. In the United States, William S. Halstead at Johns Hopkins in 1889 ordered gloves for an assistant whose hands were suffering from dermatitis, and the practice soon became recognized not only as a comfort, but as an element of sterility. Jan Mikulic Radecki implemented masks and other barrier methods on the continent. Bit by bit, the operating theatre was redesigned. Scrub rooms, autoclaves, separate sterile instrument trays, gowns that covered more skin, and a general insistence that the field be touched only with gloved, disinfected hands. The change was sensory as well as technical. The stinging smell of carbolic faded in many places. The metallic tang in the air gave way to linen and soap. Surgeons, once proud of their calloused hands and their willingness to work without pausing, had to learn new rituals: scrub, gown, glove, mask, and a surgical choreography that minimized exposure of tissue. The theatre itself became a controlled breeze, a choreography of clean surfaces. Surgeons learned to close wounds not for speed, but with the patient's microbiome in mind. They learned to leave an incision open when the tissue looked dubious. They learned, most critically for tetanus prevention, to remove what invited anaerobes, to excise devitalized tissue and foreign material, to irrigate and re-examine, to avoid the tight, poorly oxygenated pockets in which Clostridium thrived. This renewed attention to wound bed physiology, the brutal but vital practice of debridement, had practical rhythm. A surgeon in the latter decades of the 19th century who faced a dirty, penetrating wound began to think of two allied tasks: remove what was dead or devitalized, and create an environment in which oxygen and circulation could keep microbes at bay. That meant not only a scalpel, but a willingness to sacrifice tissue, to cut back beyond what might be comfortable or cosmetically pleasing in order to spare life. In battlefield medicine, the lesson was learned the hard way. The Crimean War had exposed the human cost of poor sanitation. Florence Nightingale's dispatches from Scutari, her insistence on ventilation and clean sheets, began to bring ideas of environmental hygiene into hospital practice. But the trenches of the Great War taught another lesson. A fragment of shell, an embedded piece of boot leather, a foreign body in the muscle could be the cradle of tetanus and gas gangrene. The response evolved from mere bandage to surgical revision, careful excision, irrigation, removal of debris, and, where available, the application of antiseptic dressings. The result was not perfection, but over decades a steady decline in the percentage of injuries that ended in the rigidity and fatal spasms of tetanus. That decline had another ally, one that emerged from the laboratories rather than the operating theatre. Where antisepsis and improved wound care could not be instituted fast enough, in rural clinics, on a battlefield, in a village without a scrub sink, physicians reached for serum. The end of the 19th century brought a revolution in immunology. In 1890, Emil von Behring and Shibasaburo Kitasato published work showing that the blood serum of an animal exposed to diphtheria or tetanus contained a neutralizing factor that could be transferred to another animal to confer protection. Such passive immunity, transfer of ready-made antibodies, was immediate, though temporary. The implication for human beings was obvious. If you could prepare serum in another animal and give it to a wounded patient, you might prevent the circulating toxin from doing its fatal work. The practical labour of making antitoxin was kinetic and peculiar. Horses were recruited in stables around Europe and North America, and they were injected with attenuated or inactivated toxin in ever-increasing doses to coax the production of large quantities of neutralizing antibodies. The blood of these horses would be drawn, the serum separated, the potency assayed in laboratory animals, and the antitoxin then distributed to hospitals and field units. Pasteur institutes and commercial enterprises such as Behringwerk organized production on an industrial scale. In the hands of clinicians, the serum was a powerful tool. When given early to someone with a dirty, deep wound, it could mop up free toxin in the bloodstream and forestall catastrophe. In that window of time, it brought the patient and the surgeon the opportunity to clean the wound, to debride, to reconstitute the tissue environment, and sometimes to allow the patient's own immune system time to mount a response. But the horse's gift came with costs. The serum was foreign protein, and human immune systems did not always take kindly to this donation. A syndrome of fever, rash, joint pains, and sometimes more severe reactions emerged in a fraction of recipients a week or two after treatment. The doctors called it serum sickness. The phenomenon was the price of borrowing another organism's defense. Immune complexes formed and lodged in tissues, triggering inflammation. Worse, some recipients experienced immediate allergic reactions, anaphylaxis, an abrupt, dangerous collapse when exposed to equine proteins. For all its life-saving potential, antitoxin was not benign. The laboratories and factory floors responded. Purification methods improved, dosing protocols were refined, skin testing and careful observation reduced some hazards. Yet the underlying moral discomfort remained. To save one person, public health would draw upon horse herds and risk immune complications in others. For many clinicians, the ideal would be something human. Antibodies derived from human plasma rather than equine serum, less foreign and therefore less likely to inflame the immune system. That ideal arrived in time through 20th century techniques of plasma fractionation and a reconstitution of scale in a world that had just learned how to marshal mass production for medicine. Edwin Cohn and his colleagues, working in wartime Boston in the 1940s, developed fractionation methods that separated plasma proteins on an industrial scale, producing albumin and concentrated immunoglobulin fractions amenable to clinical use. The blood banks and transfusion services that had expanded during the wars made pools of plasma available. From those pools, after careful screening and purification, came human tetanus immune globulin, TEG, a preparation that carried neutralizing antibodies without the equine proteins that provoked so much trouble. Human TEG did not remove every problem. Supply required donors, the product needed refrigeration and cold chain logistics, and standards of potency had to be established. But it removed many of the immunological hazards and became the therapy of choice for passive immunization in the mid-20th century, especially in wealthier health systems. Across the same period, another, more durable solution was being refined. Teach the body to make its own antibodies. This is the quiet arc that moves from antitoxin to toxoid, from the transient passivity of serum transfer to the robust, long-lived memory of vaccination. Gaston Ramon at the Pasteur Institute in the 1920s formalized a technique that would become central to tetanus prevention: inactivate the toxin chemically. The poison that bound tightly to nerve endings could be tamed, rendered non-toxic and yet still recognizable to the immune system. Ramon used formaldehyde to convert toxin into a toxoid, an antigen that would prompt antibody production without exposing a person to the risk of full-blown tetanus. Slightly later, Alexander Glennie in England discovered that aluminum salts could act as adjuvants, substances that amplify the immune response to toxoid, a small addition that had outsized effects on the durability and strength of the protection. Those laboratory innovations mattered for armies. In the First World War, antitoxin was used relentlessly. By the Second, toxoid immunization on a mass scale had become an instrument of military policy. Young men conscripted into service were given injections to prime their immune systems against tetanus. The difference in outcome between the two wars is striking in a way that military historians sometimes overlook. Fewer soldiers died of tetanus among televised columns of wounded in the 1940s than in the trenches of the 1910s, not principally because bullets had changed, but because the human body had been taught, before it faced the wound, how to resist the toxin that might later be released. The discipline of army vaccination, compulsory, logistically exacting, and backed by the machinery of supply depots and medical corps, became a blueprint for civilian public health. After the wars, peacetime institutions took up the practice and the challenge of scaling it. The toxoid did not remain a solitary vaccine. With the rise of combined vaccines, the convenience and coverage multiply. Diphtheria and tetanus toxoids, along with whole-cell pertussis in the mid-century formulations, found their way into a single injection, the DTP vaccine. Mass immunization programs, often state-sponsored, placed DTP into childhood schedules. School entry requirements, public clinics, vaccines given at well baby visits, these bureaucratic pieces of social machinery normalized the practice. A child carrying a vaccination card was a modern expectation in many countries. The National Health Service in Britain, established in 1948, institutionalized many such expectations. In the United States, the public health infrastructure and state school requirements did similar work, and by the 1950s and 1960s, routine childhood immunization was no longer an oddity, but the baseline. Behind every needle was a story of logistics. Producing millions of doses requires factories and raw materials, quality control and assays of potency, regulatory regimes to ensure safety, and cold chains to carry vaccines from plants to outlying clinics. It required training nurses, setting up schedules, keeping records, and persuading a public sometimes wary of interventions. It required that ministries of health commandeer supply chains and that international organisations, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and others, coordinate efforts across borders. When the WHO launched its expanded programme on immunisation in 1974, it was defining a global standard: routinely immunise children against a core set of preventable diseases, including tetanus. The aim was not to extinguish a soil-dwelling bacterium. It was, more modestly and more ambitiously, to deprive it of easy human victims. That distinction is crucial. Clostridium tetani is a hardy environmental spore. It will not yield to eradication because it does not rely on human-to-human chains of transmission. Even in countries where vaccination coverage became high, a rusted nail and a bare foot in a field could still be the first step toward a case. The vaccine changed the risk calculus for individuals and for societies by converting tetanus into the disease of the unvaccinated and the immunologically forgotten. In wealthy nations, the elderly who had never received a modern toxoid series or whose immunity had waned became the disproportionate reservoir of residual cases. In low-resource regions, maternal and neonatal tetanus continued to appear where women lacked access to prenatal immunisation and births occurred in unsanitary conditions. Public health response adapted accordingly. Maternal immunisation emerged as a pragmatic, targeted strategy. Immunise girls and women of reproductive age with toxoids so that they carry antibodies that protect their newborns during the brief, vulnerable period before a baby's own immune system matures. Combined with efforts to promote clean births, sterile cord care, clean attendance, and antiseptic practices at delivery, maternal vaccination campaigns proved extremely effective at reducing neonatal tetanus. The scale of those campaigns was considerable. Governments and international agencies coordinated mass dosing campaigns in rural districts where routine services were limited, sending teams of vaccinators into villages, tracking women of childbearing age, and delivering repeated shots when needed. The logistics were familiar, but relentless. The cold chain, the transport of vials over roads that might be little more than tracks, record-keeping, local persuasion, and the small diplomacy of health workers convincing sceptical families. The cultural framing of vaccination also mattered, where once the fear of lockjaw, a potent visceral image, helped drive acceptance. Social programs deliberately turned prevention into a civic routine. School requirements, maternal clinics, antenatal visits, and later the convenience of combination vaccines made receiving a tetanus shot a normal event, an unremarkable entry on a child's health card. In the clinic's rhythm, people vaccinated when they came for other care. The health bureaucracy turned a problem of sporadic emergency prophylaxis into one of continuous routine prevention. The effect is the slow, civil kind of revolution, a reduction in the number of people who ever face tetanus because most citizens had been primed against it long before they step on a nail. Yet that normalization contains an irony. When a disease becomes rare, the memory of its ravages fades. The visceral horror of a single case in a community can be the spur to high vaccine uptake. The absence of that drama can allow complacency. So health authorities persisted with reminders, booster campaigns, and in many places mandated school entry checks to keep coverage high. The rules of wound care also hardened into protocols. An emergency department in a modern hospital will assess a puncture wound for tetanus risk, check vaccination status, and, if necessary, administer human tetanus immune globulin while also giving a toxoid booster. The clinic practices learned in the era of antisepsis and serum therapy have become codified, routinized small acts of prophylaxis that together finish off what the surgeon and the scientist began. There are still tensions and edges to this history. The equine antitoxin that once saved lives while sometimes provoking immune storms shows how an expedient solution can both rescue and wound. The toxoid, chemically sterilized and attached to an adjuvant, shows how an understanding of molecular structure can be rotated into public protection. The battlefield teaches medicine about urgency and throughput. The maternity ward teaches it about humility and prevention. And always there is scale. One hospital that learns to autoclave its instruments helps one community, but a national system that vaccinates millions changes the epidemiology of an entire country. In the sweep from the 19th century theatre to the 20th century mass campaign, certain practical truths recur. Take away the dirt and you reduce opportunities for spores to land and hide. Teach bodies to recognise and neutralise toxin, and you convert a potential catastrophe into a mathematical rarity. Build systems to deliver shots on schedule, and you create a societal shield that does not depend on luck or serendipity. Those truths are logistical rather than romantic. They live in lists of supplies, in schedules for visits, in the rhythms of night clinics and the churn of cold boxes on a delivery truck. Historians can and should linger over personalities and publications, but the eventual triumph over surgery-associated tetanus is the product of thousands of humble, small-scale acts of organisation, training and, yes, insistence. There is a gentle cruelty in the story. The microbe that does not negotiate, that cares nothing for human pride, died to little bit of chemistry and to countless acts of routine labour. Surgeons learned humility in the face of the unseen. Armies learned that prevention was cheaper than cure. Public health learned the arithmetic of Swarovski, and mothers are learned to bring children for visits that would shield them from an old fear. The decline of post-operative tetanus has not been a miracle so much as a long, patient, bureaucratic love. A love administered in doses, in sterile technique, in the steady hand of a vaccinator threading a needle in a village hall, and in the stubborn insistence of people who would not let their hospitals be places where infection could settle and flourish. There are still places where spores lie in wait, and still individuals whose immunity has been neglected. But the mechanics of prevention are understood. The surgeon who trims dead tissue now does so with the tacit knowledge that oxygen and circulation are allies. The clinician who reaches for human immunoglobulin does so knowing its limits and its place. The public health official who organises a mass maternal immunisation campaign does so knowing the scale of transportation and persuasion necessary. In the quiet hours after the work is done, one can imagine a surgeon cleaning instruments with the calm of a ritual born of knowledge rather than ritual alone. One can imagine a woman in a rural clinic receiving a toxoid injection and thinking only of the day to come, not of the fear that a century earlier would have made childbirth a tinderbox for tetanus. So the story winds on, less a triumphal march than a patient assembly. The disease that once broke spines and stiffened mouths into grim masks has been edged back by the twin crafts of environment and immunology, by the antiseptic towel and the toxoid syringe, by the logistician who maps cold chains, and by the nurse who stands in the rain to deliver them. The world is not free of Clostridium tetani, but it is, in many places, a much less hospitable place for its toxin. The surgeon's theatre no longer hums with the fatal small talk of invisible guests, and the horse's serum, once heroic, has given way to human-made dignity in the form of vaccines and immune globulins. It is, in the slow language of public health, a long, ordinary success, the kind that saves lives not with spectacle but with systems, and that, when you think of it, is a very comforting story to fall asleep to. The battlefield has always been a school where lessons arrive late and the tuition is paid in human lives. Tetanus learned at the front pays tuition for medicine afterward. Long before vaccines stitched a safety net under civilians and soldiers alike, the spikes and splinters of war made small wounds into mortal wages. In the Crimean hospitals of the 1850s, soldiers nursed leg wounds that closed on the surface only to betray them weeks later with a jaw that would not open and muscles that began to dance on their own. Florence Nightingale wrote of filthy wards and of the stubborn persistence of infections that antiseptic practices could not yet fully tame. Surgeons in the American Civil War catalogued the same phenomenon. A cleanly sutured limb, the proud work of a field surgeon, followed by the slow onset of rigidity that people called lockjaw. Joseph Lister's antiseptic experiments of the late 1860s nudged surgery towards sterility, but in the mud and the bomb crater of modern war, an invisible foe waited in the soil and in pocked equipment, spores of Clostridium tetani, patient and indifferent to bullets and bandages. By the end of the 19th century, the work of bacteriologists had at last named the enemy. In laboratories from Tokyo to Berlin, researchers such as Kitasato Shibasaburo and Emil von Behring demonstrated that the tetanus bacillus produced a potent neurotoxin, and that serum from immunized animals could, in principle, neutralize it. The discovery, reported in 1890, promised an antidote to the old dread. But the promise was not a simple delivery. It required factories, horses, and horse handlers, the complicated alchemy of producing antitoxin from immunized equines and then purifying, testing, and moving heavy glass bottles to the places where they were needed. It required trains and carts and the steady hands of pharmacists. It required above all an acceptance that medicine could, for a price and with limitations, tame such a toxin when given early enough. Those early antitoxins found their first great proving grounds in military campaigns. Around the Boer War at the turn of the century, and more decisively in the trenches of the First World War from 1914 to 1918, the problem was not only medical but logistical. Trench warfare, mechanised artillery and long slow clearing of contaminated battlefields created the perfect conditions for tetanus. Deep dirty wounds that harboured anaerobic niches ideal for spore germination. Surgeons writing in the journals of the Royal Army Medical Corps and their German and French counterparts detailed after-action inventories that read more like inventories of preventable loss. Field hospitals tucked behind the lines kept vials of equine antitoxin on hand. They injected passively transferred antibodies into soldiers with severe wounds and into those they considered high risk, hoping that the serum might buy time for the patient or spare him the toxin's advance. Personal correspondence from the era, letters from young medics and nurses folded into envelopes and sent home, amplify what the official records suggest. A surgeon in Flanders would write in a small cramped hand about nights spent debriding limbs and about the peculiar terror of an otherwise unremarkable wound turning lethal in the dark between rounds. Nurses described the sound of spasms in the night, the way a man's body might suddenly arch as if in a moment of private lightning. Those letters, held now in military archives, are not lurid. They are pragmatic. They make note of the supply lines that failed, of the vials that did not arrive, of the need to dilute serum to serve more men, and of the bitter irony that a remedy existed but could not always be delivered where and when it mattered. The interwar years brought a different kind of weapon, active immunisation. In the laboratories of Paris and London, scientists learned how to inactivate the tetanus toxin into a toxoid that could safely induce immune protection without causing disease. Gaston Ramon at the Pasteur Institute and others in the 1920s refined techniques to render toxins harmless by formalin treatment, and thereby to prepare material that, when injected, would prompt the body to produce its own antibodies. This was not a sudden panacea. It required quality control, multiple doses, cold chains and a bureaucracy to administer boosters. It also required a change of attitude, an acceptance that prevention was not charity but strategy, that strategic thinking was accelerated by the second great conflagration of the 20th century. In the Second World War, the scale of mobilization made vaccination policy a matter of military efficiency. Armies moved thousands of recruits across oceans. They crossed environments where tetanus spores were common. They buried casualties in foreign soils and came back to the front again. Practicality prevailed. Active immunization programs were rolled into recruit training and pre-deployment medical workups. Improvised field laboratories and national vaccine manufacturers retooled to produce toxoid in large quantities. The United States, Britain, Germany, the Soviet Union, each in its own way, had to cope with the twin demands of treating wounded soldiers and protecting the uninjured. The result was that a prophylactic vaccine, once the province of research labs, became part of the logistical matrix that sustained modern armies. The effect on peacetime public health policy was immediate and profound. Medical officers who had seen the frontline benefits of tetanus immunization argued, after the wars, for broader civilian programs. Military records and post-war reports supplied the data. Lower tetanus incidents among vaccinated soldiers, fewer deaths when antitoxin and ventilatory support were available. Politicians, always responsive to arguments framed in the language of national security and fiscal prudence, found it easiest to underwrite vaccination programs that once might have been dismissed as optional. Public health ministries repurposed cold chains and personnel, once used to serve mobilization, to serve routine immunization of children, mothers and other at-risk populations. Navy yards, army depots and Pasteur institutes, once engines of war, became nodes in public health networks that distributed toxoid to schools and clinics. In a sense, the wars taught two lessons at once: how dangerous tetanus could be, and how scalable its prevention was when organised on national lines. Yet the battlefield also taught the limits of technology when logistics fail. Equine antitoxin, the early mainstay, could provoke serum sickness and anaphylaxis. Supply lines could be cut. Vaccination required repeated doses and record-keeping in times when record-keeping was most difficult. And there were always those who fell through the net. Civilians in rural hinterlands, partisans, refugees, people for whom clinics were far away, or for whom the memory of war still held a suspicion of authority. The paradox of tetanus in war was that the urgency of conflict produced medical innovations, but that the chaos of conflict also exposed the fragilities of implementing them where they were most needed. From the crash of shells to the hush of a rural midwife's hut, tetanus has a voice that is soft and patient, and the wounds it exploits are often the ones left out of histories because they happen at the margins. Neonatal tetanus, the quiet cousin of battlefield tetanus, takes its victims at the moment of entry into the world. For centuries, in villages from the Ganges plain to the East African highlands, the cord that tied a child to life was often cut with whatever tool lay to hand. A knife, a blade of glass, a razor. That stump, exposed and tender, was sometimes dressed with substances believed to be protective: ashes, herbal pastes, cow dung, butter, each with cultural total meaning, each a local technique meant to ensure survival. Those practices persisted for many reasons: trust in elders and traditional birth attendants, the costs of clinic-based births, the remoteness of health services, the control of women's mobility by male kin, and a cultural invisibility that made neonatal death an accepted sorrow rather than an embarrassment to be remedied. Recognition that these practices underlay a large proportion of neonatal deaths led, in the late 20th century, to a concerted global effort. In 1989, the World Health Organization, alongside UNICEF and partners, launched the Maternal and Neonatal Tetanus Elimination Initiative, setting a bold public health goal to reduce neonatal tetanus to a level where it was no longer a significant public health problem. The strategy was twofold and elegantly simple. First, vaccinate women of reproductive age so that they pass protective antibodies to their newborns. Second, promote clean birth practices to prevent infection at the umbilical stump. The logistics were deceptively straightforward on paper: immunize, teach, clean. But on the ground, the work required brute patience, cultural humility, and an infrastructure that could reach remote valleys and beleaguered urban slums. What followed was one of the more heartening chapters in global public health. Mass immunization campaigns, carefully planned supplementary immunization activities that targeted women of childbearing age in high-risk districts, were paired with efforts to equip birth attendants with clean delivery kits and to train them in antiseptic cord care. Trials in South Asia and parts of Africa showed that applying a simple antiseptic such as chlorhexidine to the cord stump could substantially reduce infection in settings where clean deliveries were rare. WHO guidance later recommended cord cleansing with chlorhexidine for home births in areas of high neonatal mortality. The campaigns were not purely technical exercises. They required social engineering, community meetings, the enlistment of local religious and civic leaders, and the trustworthy presence of female community health workers who could gain access to homes where male health workers could not go. Success stories accumulated. Countries as diverse as Nepal and Bangladesh found that a network of local volunteers, paired with targeted vaccine drives and a push for clean delivery, could dramatically reduce neonatal deaths. In Nepal, female community health volunteers became the sinew of outreach efforts, walking mountainous footpaths, sometimes for days, to reach expecting mothers and to bring with them a vaccine vial and a promise. In Bangladesh, trials and subsequent scale-up of cord care interventions and maternal immunization dovetailed with broader gains in maternal child health. Across Latin America and parts of Asia, integration of antenatal clinics, routine immunization and community health education brought forward a steady decline in neonatal tetanus. These were not miracles. They were the mechanics of planning and logistics, micro-mapping of villages, stockpiles of vaccine, careful cold chain management, and the patient work of persuading families that a modern antiseptic need not despise tradition. There were and remain stubborn places where the campaign hits the hardest of obstacles. Conflict zones, of course, are particularly cruel to public health. In countries such as Afghanistan, Somalia, parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan, insecurity repeatedly undermines efforts to vaccinate mothers and to ensure safe deliveries. Displacement scatters communities, clinics close, supply lines are ruptured. Surveillance is weak. When a newborn dies at home under the watch of a grandmother, the death might not be counted. Cultural practices that persist in peace may be exacerbated by crisis. In these settings, the programmatic lessons are blunt and necessary. Vaccination must be flexible and mobile, community engagement must be relentless, and elimination efforts require a sustained political commitment that outlasts the flare of conflict. Equity, not merely coverage, is the lesson most often learned at the end of such campaigns. Mass vaccination will reduce a disease in aggregate, but pockets of vulnerability remain where health systems are thin and social marginalisation deep. The MNTE experience underlined that elimination is not simply a technical achievement but a distributive one. When governments and partners insisted that the last 1% be treated with the same rigour as the first 99%, when campaigns sought out the remotest settlements, negotiated ceasefires to allow health workers passage, and trained and compensated community volunteers, progress accelerated. When they did not, outbreaks lingered like a stubborn weed. In modern hospitals, the diagnosis of tetanus is still, stubbornly, a bedside art. Laboratory tests can sometimes find the bacterium in a wound or detect toxin genes in specialised labs, but for the clinician in a district hospital or an intensive care unit, the recognition is clinical. The jaw that will not open, trismus, the sudden painful spasms provoked by the smallest stimulus, the sardonic facial contortions that medicine has long called risus sardonicus, the back-arching into opisthotonus, the newborn that refuses to suck and then seizes. These are the signs that make the physician say, simply and with a certain grim respect, tetanus. Modern management is a choreography of several hands moving together, and the earliest moves matter. First, neutralise what can be neutralised. Human tetanus immune globulin, when available, is given to bind circulating toxin that is not yet irreversibly attached to nerve endings. That is passive protection, immediate though partial. Historically, equine antitoxin served a similar role, but it carried risks of hypersensitivity reactions. Human immune globulin is safer and standard where it can be procured. Second, remove the source. That means thorough wound care, surgical debridement to remove necrotic tissue that fosters anaerobes, irrigation, and when necessary, re-exploration to ensure there are no pockets of infection. Anaerobic coverage with antibiotics is routine. Metronidazole has become the favoured agent in many settings because of its efficacy against anaerobes and a cleaner side effect profile than older alternatives. Third, control the body's unruly reaction. Spasms and rigidity are treated with sedatives and muscle relaxants. Benzodiazepines such as diazepam or midazolam are the core drugs, sometimes combined with neuromuscular blockers and intubation for patients who cannot protect their airways or who suffer respiratory compromise. This last point is where the divide between resource-rich and resource-limited settings becomes most cruelly visible. In an intensive care unit with access to mechanical ventilation, a patient with severe tetanus can be sedated, intubated and supported for days or weeks while the toxin wanes and the nerves slowly recover. Outcomes that would once have been fatal are now often survivable. Autonomic instability, swings of blood pressure, paroxysmal tachycardia, profuse sweating can be managed with magnesium sulfate, beta blockade, and careful fluid and electrolyte support. The prolonged nature of illness in severe cases, however, makes the resource burden immense. Ventilators tied up for weeks, round-the-clock nursing for suctioning and positioning, the need for physiotherapy to prevent contractures, and the ever-present risk of ventilator-associated pneumonia and other iatrogenic harms. In these settings, survival can mean a long, painful recovery that requires rehabilitation services often absent from the plans of post-conflict ministries. In contrast, in many district hospitals and clinics where ventilators are scarce and access to immune globulin unreliable, the prognosis remains grim. A child in a rural clinic with a cord infection may present with spasms, and then, within days, with progressive respiratory compromise. Without antitoxin, without mechanical ventilation, and without intensive supportive care, many such children die. These comparative realities are not mere statistics, they are the arithmetic of access. They are why global health efforts emphasize both prevention, through maternal immunization and clean delivery programs, and the strengthening of systems that can at least recognize and refer cases early. Diagnostic nuance is worth a paragraph of its own. Culture of C. tetani from wounds is possible, but rarely positive, and has little immediate effect on treatment choices. The mouse bioassay to detect toxin, once a laboratory staple, is ethically unsavory and impractical for acute management. Molecular assays exist in specialized centers but are not part of frontline medicine. Thus, the frontline clinician must be comfortable making a therapeutic decision on the basis of a story and an examination, a recent puncture wound, the classic signs, and a clinician's judgment. The clinical thresholds for giving antitoxin or for escalating care must remain low when the risk is high, and when the incubation period is short, for latency correlates with severity. A wound-producing disease within a few days warns of a heavy toxin load and worse outcome. There are pragmatic details, the things that shape survival beyond drugs and machines. Tetanus disease does not confer immunity. The quantity of toxin required to produce disease is usually far less than the quantity required to stimulate a protective immune response. Thus, every survivor must be vaccinated during convalescence with tetanus toxoid to provide future protection. Hospitals need protocols to provide post-exposure prophylaxis for injured but previously unprotected individuals, combining tetanus immune globulin when indicated with a schedule of active immunization. Stock management matters. Facilities must know when to order immune globulin, when to refrigerate vials, and how to trace immunization histories when patients cannot speak for themselves. Case comparisons help to make the stakes clear. Consider, without names, two patients whose courses diverge at the threshold of care. One is a farmer with a deep nail puncture who walks to a rural clinic 2 days later complaining of jaw stiffness and difficulty swallowing. The clinic has no immune globulin, no ventilator, and only oral sedatives. The patient is given metronidazole, local wound care, and an oral sedative, and is transferred if possible. Survival is uncertain. The other is a middle-aged man in a city who slips on a metal bar and is rushed to a surgical intensive care unit within hours. He receives human immune globulin, surgical debridement in an operating theatre, metronidazole, and, when spasms become frequent, endotracheal intubation and mechanical ventilation with heavy sedation. Weeks later, he leaves with a tetanus vaccination card and a long list of rehabilitation appointments. The difference is not the biology of the toxin, it's the resources marshalled against it. Modern therapeutics have been an exercise in layering. Antitoxin to neutralize what is unbound, antibiotics to quench the microbe, surgical care to remove the nidus, sedation and neuromuscular control to spare lungs and bones, and supportive ICU care to weather the storm. Magnesium sulfate deserves particular mention. Inexpensive and widely available, it acts as a neuromuscular blocker and a stabilizer of autonomic storms, and in many resource-limited settings its use has been associated with improved outcomes where ventilatory resources were scarce. Its role underscores a recurring theme, that middle ground interventions, pragmatic and affordable, can sometimes close the gap between survival and death when the most advanced technologies are not available. The arc of tetanus over 2 centuries is a story of human ingenuity leavened by social structure. War taught laboratory scientists how to focus on prevention. War also taught logisticians that vaccines must be deliverable in the mud as well as in the laboratory. The campaign against neonatal tetanus taught public health practitioners that the last mile is often a social one, that convincing a grandmother to cut the cord with a sterile blade can be as important as a vial of immune globulin. The clinic teaches every day that diagnosis will remain an art in the absence of costly tests, and that the mechanics of ICU care, ventilators, nursing ratios, ventilated beds, are as determinative as any drug. These lessons, when narrated in the slow voice of someone who has watched patterns repeat, have their own kind of humour, dark and dry. We are, as a species, efficient learners in crisis, innovative in emergency, and yet often slow to carry those innovations into the quiet places where they are most needed. War made antitoxin and toxoid into household names within medical circles. Peacetime should have been the epoch of equitable extension. The irony is sharp. The very conditions that accelerate invention are the ones that also coarsen the distribution of its benefits. There is something almost architectural in this truth, that medicine builds balconies from which some will look out at their saved lives while others are left to peer through a hole in the wall. Still, the work continues in ways that are quietly heroic. Community volunteers walking mountain tracks with cool boxes of vaccine. Nurses in understaffed clinics holding the hand of a convulsing infant as they wait for transport. Critical care teams turning on monitors and adjusting magnesium drips while a family stands in a corner and prays or watches the slow beeping of machines. The modern clinical pathway, wound debridement in an operating theatre, antitoxin in a refrigerated drawer, metronidazole in a pharmacy, sedation titrated to effect, ventilator settings adjusted nightly, is the product of a long chain of wartime and peacetime experiments. It is also a fragile edifice. It depends on steady health systems, on supply chains that are not interrupted by conflict, and on the persistent political will to vaccinate the people who are, historically, easiest to overlook. When the night is very quiet and the wards are still, a physician might read a century of medical texts and field reports and see how small changes save lives. A single needle plant in the upper arm of a pregnant woman in a remote village can prevent a child from suffering and dying. A vial of immune globulin carried by a medic in a battlefield can blunt a toxin before it crosses a synapse. A trained midwife who insists on a clean blade and a dry cord can reorder fate. The history of tetanus is not a simple progress narrative of triumphs and neat closures. It is an accumulated ledger of human choices about how to use the tools we have and whom we choose to protect. It is a story that begins in war and in dirt and moves toward prevention, ever guided by the patient work of logistics, culture, and clinical care. When the story of tetanus is told on the maps of the 21st century, it reads like a geography of success, stitched with islands of stubborn failure. In cities with humming cold rooms, in hospitals where midwives carry vaccination cards in their pockets and community clinics have lists that are updated by phone, tetanus is a ghost of memory. A disease that used to call the names of newborns and soldiers and farmhands but no longer does so loudly. In those places in Britain, France, the United States, Japan, much of Western Europe, and later, the prosperous coastal belts of East Asia and Latin America, the decline of tetanus is as methodical as the scale-up of a public health machine. The World Health Organization's expanded program on immunization, launched in 1974, set the gears turning. Routine childhood schedules, combined vaccines, such as DTP, antenatal tetanus toxoid for pregnant women, and the disciplined choreography of supply, transport and storage that a functioning health system requires. The work did not look heroic. It looked logistical. It looked like refrigerators and lists and nurses who arrived on time. That is where the story of tetanus becomes a study in what systems can do. Toxoid vaccines, tools that trace back decades, Gaston Ramon's formalin inactivated toxoids in the 1920s, Kitasato and Behring's anti-toxin experiments in the late 19th century were not miraculous in the theatrical sense. Their power was revealed in repetition. Doses delivered according to schedule, boosters given, pregnant women immunized to protect their babies from the first vulnerable days of life. In militaries, during the First and Second World Wars, the pattern was stark and practical. Wound care, antitoxin when indicated, and prophylactic immunization for recruits and frontline medical units. The casualties of infected wounds fell. In the prosperous decades after 1945, the combination of antibiotics, tetanus toxoid, improved surgical practice and better sanitary infrastructure pushed tetanus into the margins of clinical experience in these societies. Compare that with the other map. Here, tetanus refuses to be politely retired. It lingers in the margins, remote mountain districts where the nearest clinic is a day's walk, in flood-prone riverine plains where birthing takes place on dirt floors, in refugee camps where cold boxes are scarce and vaccination records are left behind in the rubble after a sudden exodus. Where active conflict fractures delivery systems, tetanus reappears. It is not merely the absence of a vaccine on a shelf that preserves the disease. It is the absence of roads, of reliable electricity, of trained birth attendants, of trust between health workers and communities, of documentation and surveillance. The global initiative to eliminate maternal and neonatal tetanus, mounted in 1989 by WHO together with UNICEF and partners, acknowledged this plainly. Vaccinations alone are necessary but not sufficient. They required clean delivery practices and the ability to reach every woman of reproductive age with multiple vaccine doses when appropriate. They required the heavy lifting of cold chains and the nimble work of community health outreach. In many fragile states, that heavy lifting was impossible. There are names and dates that mark progress. The expanded program on immunization, 1974. The launch of the Maternal and Neonatal Tetanus Elimination Initiative, 1989. The formation of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, in 2000, which brought new finance and emphasis on cold chain infrastructure. The gradual validation by WHO of countries that had met the elimination criteria, defined not by zero cases everywhere, an impossible goal given Clostridium tetani ubiquity in soil, but by the public health threshold of fewer than one case of neonatal tetanus per 1,000 live births in every district. In India, long a focus of global attention because of the scale of its population and the concentration of rural poverty, intensified campaigns in the 90s and 2000s, along with improvements in institutional births and neonatal care, culminated in national validation of elimination in the mid-2010s. That was a logistic triumph, tens of millions of tetanus toxoid doses bundled into supplementary immunization activities, meetings with local NGOs, training of auxiliary nurse midwives, the careful recording of births at district level. Yet for every district that reached that threshold, there were districts that did not. The epidemiology of tetanus is, to be brutally frank, the epidemiology of absence. Absence of antenatal care, absence of skilled birth attendants, absence of regular boosters for adult populations who have slipped through childhood schedules. Neonatal tetanus, the death of infants who breathe, fight, and then slowly succumb because the umbilical stump became an unsterile portal, remains a sentinel for poverty. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and in pockets within otherwise well-served countries, socio-economic gradients map neatly onto tetanus incidents. Women who have had limited schooling, who live more than an hour's walk from a health facility, who deliver at home because cost or distance make hospitals impractical, are at higher risk. That is not a moral failing. It is a structural one. Weak surveillance compounds the problem. Tetanus is a clinical diagnosis. Clostridium tetani is common in soil, and the disease doesn't announce itself to laboratories the way poliovirus might be sought in stool samples. Many deaths occur in homes and are recorded as unknown neonatal death, or simply vanish from official registers. In a county without a functioning civil registration system, a newborn could die before the week is out and the death will not trigger any epidemiological alarm. Verbal autopsy, the painstaking interviews used to assign probable cause of death when no medical record exists, is imperfect. Misclassification is common. The practical consequence is that international statistics often undercount the real burden, and modelers must rely on proxies, antenatal care coverage, number of births attended by skilled personnel, reported vaccination coverage, vaccine supply records. Administrative coverage figures may look impressive on paper when a ministry reports that 95% of women were reached in a campaign. But when those figures are checked against house-by-house validation surveys, there can be large gaps. Program planners learn to live with this dissonance. Impressive administrative coverage. Patches of unprotected life on the ground. Then there is the matter of logistics in the literal kinetic sense. Tetanus toxoid vaccines are perishable. Cold chains, a chain of refrigerators and insulated boxes, and transport procedures that preserve potency from factory to clinic are the circulatory system of immunization programs. In the 80s and 90s, many campaigns faltered because refrigerators failed, because diesel supplies for generators were cut off, because the long rainy season made roads impassable and vaccines sat in trucks exposed to the sun. Innovations since then have helped. Solar refrigerators, improved ice packs, and better temperature monitors. The vaccine vial monitor, a small chemical discoloration indicator attached to vials to show heat exposure, has been a modestly heroic innovation, allowing vaccinators in remote posts to make decisions with more confidence. Still, the last mile remains treacherous. A half-hour's hesitation by a health worker to accept that the blue-tinted vial is still good is often the difference between protection and exposure for a newborn. Conflict is a second cruel amplifier. The Syrian war, the collapse of services in Yemen, the long insecurity in parts of Somalia and South Sudan, the intermittent violence in northern Nigeria and in eastern Afghanistan, each of these places funnels people into more crowded, insecure settings where routine immunization stalls. Vaccination campaigns require planning, lists, permission from local leaders, safe corridors. They require that vaccinators are willing and able to visit locations without being attacked. When trust breaks down, when rumour and fear replace dialogue, immunisation rates drop precipitously. The result is predictable. Diseases that had receded come back to visit. Tetanus, because it is environmental, will not burst through borders in a wave the way measles does, but it quietly returns in the places where ordinary birth practices have not shifted and where booster coverage is low. The inequity is gendered. Maternal and neonatal tetanus is centred on the experience of giving birth. Babies are born immediately vulnerable to their mother's immune status. A pregnant woman with documented tetanus toxoid immunity, 2 appropriately timed doses, passes on protective antibodies to her newborn. If she has not been immunised, if she labours alone in a hut and the umbilical cord is cut with an unsterile instrument, the risk multiplies. Health systems that marginalise women, that treat antenatal care as optional or incidental, that make delivery in formal facilities prohibitively expensive, concentrate the burden of tetanus among the least powerful. That is a moral calculus as much as an epidemiological one. Surveillance gaps, too, are political. Countries that have fragmented health ministries that have low investment in district-level capacity cannot detect and respond to the small clusters of cases that indicate a failing system. The WHO's elimination validation requires data, and data requires work that local health bureaucracies are often underpaid and undersupported to do. International partners have sometimes focused on spectacular, globally prioritised campaigns and less on the patient, unglamorous work of building routine health systems, trained midwives, functioning antenatal clinics, record-keeping. The result is that even as headline numbers fall, the last pockets of disease are the stubborn. In epidemiological terms, tetanus becomes a disease of inequality. The greater the inequity within a country, the more likely that tetanus will find its foothold in the soft tissues of neglect. The cultural map matters here. Where communities have long-standing practices of home birth, sometimes enforced by tradition, interventions that ignore those practices will fail. Health policymakers learned this with painful clarity. Mass vaccination days bring vaccines. They are often successful in achieving temporary coverage, but unless they are woven into long-term relationships, respect for local birth attendants, training and payment for those attendants, respectful maternity care, and trust evaporates. The history of tetanus control thus reads like a long lesson in humility. Technological tools are necessary, but they must be married to social understanding and community partnership. The story, however, does not end on the epidemiological terrain. Tetanus has always been as much a thing in culture as it has been a thing in clinics. The clinical sign that medical students memorise, rhesus sardonicus, the fixed, sardonic smile that clamps the jaw and holds the lips in a ghastly grin, entered language and imagination long before bacteriology gave it an explanation. The term itself pulls across centuries. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History in the 1st century, wrote of a Sardinian plant that caused the face to contort in laughter before death, an evil smile that grinned like mockery at the onlooker. The ancients wrapped etiology in myth. The modern term sardonic carries that residue, so that even today a physician describing a patient's sardonic grin invokes an etymology that spans islands, herbs, and centuries. That grin became a cultural sign. In the 19th century, as medical photography and clinical portraiture proliferated, the contorted bodies of patients, locked jaws, arched backs, rigid limbs, were photographed not only for science but for public persuasion. Medical students learned from the images, and reformers used them in pamphlets. There is a cruel economy to those images. They are arresting, easy to reproduce, and they condense the dread of death into a single face. It becomes tempting for public health campaigns to wield that image as a tool. Posters that warn mothers about dirty blades or unclean cord care sometimes invoked the contorted infant face to incite action. The effect was double-edged. For some, the image propelled change. For others, it cemented stigma. Metaphor did work, and it also did harm. The colloquial term lockjaw has the simplicity that policymakers love, a single memorable label that anchors an abstract fear. Political rhetoric has appropriated tetanus metaphors too. Leaders likened social ills to tetanus. Our institutions are locked in, the country's spine is broken, which played into deeper cultural anxieties about paralysis and control. The phrase broken spine itself, invoked sometimes to describe the social fabric or the moral backbone of a community, twisted an anatomical reality into political theatre. When tetanus was spoken of as a broken spine, attention naturally shifted to a narrative of repair. Put in a brace, set the bone, restore order. But tetanus is not purely mechanical. It emerges from environment, practice and access. Metaphors of fracture and repair could obscure the social determinants that required long, patient social work. The literature recorded tetanus in ways that taught societies how to fear it. Travel writers and medical memoirists in the 19th and early 20th centuries used lockjaw as shorthand for exotic danger or for the grim consequences of unmodern life. It became part of the lexicon of modernity. Where sanitation had not arrived, the risk of lockjaw signalled that other modern protections had not arrived either. By the 20th century, writers and journalists deployed the image of the contorted child to shame or to mobilise aid. The problem with shame as a lever is that it distances those who would be helped rather than drawing them in. In colonial settings, the imagery of tetanus was sometimes weaponised. Colonial authorities emphasised native backwardness as the reason for high neonatal mortality, which justified top-down interventions that sidelined local practices and knowledge. That paternalism often produced resistance, not cooperation. Religion and ritual contributed threads to the metaphors. In some cultures, the sudden, dramatic death of a newborn, or the face that seems to smile even in death, was read as a sign of fate or of spiritual transgression. Traditional explanations could include malevolent spirits, curses, or the anger of ancestors. Health workers who approached these communities with a purely biomedical message, "This is bacteria, get vaccinated," often found their message ignored until they addressed the cosmology as well. Programs that combined biomedical outreach with respectful engagement with local leaders and traditional birth attendants fared better. The requirement was simple but demanding: humility. Public memory absorbed tetanus stories in other ways. In art and literature, the contorted body became an emblem not only of physical pain but of social decay. The sardonic grin showed up in paintings and in stage dramas as a symbol of society's inability to care for its weakest. The aestheticization of suffering is dangerous because it can make the public complacent. We recognize the image, we admire its craft, and we do not always translate that recognition into policy. Conversely, at times, culture amplified the urgency for public health, pushing governments to fund clinics, cold chains and midwifery training, because the public felt a moral tug when confronted with photographs of infants struck at the umbilical stump. There is an irony in the way metaphor shaped policy. When tetanus was framed as a problem of cleanliness and birth practice, programs followed: clean delivery kits, chlorhexidine cord care, training of birth attendants. When it was framed primarily as a vaccination issue, campaigns emphasised mass immunisation of women of reproductive age. Neither approach was wrong. Both were incomplete. The most effective policies were those that accepted the multiplicity of framings and integrated them. Vaccination to provide systemic immunity, clean delivery to reduce immediate exposure, surveillance to find the remaining cases, community engagement to change practice, and, importantly, social policy measures to pull women out of the daily conditions that make unclean births likely. Metaphor deployed thoughtfully helped make policy choices legible. Use carelessly, it obscured complexity. That leads to the final chapter of this long tale. What tetanus teaches us about public health's architecture, about what we must do now and what we must not forget. If there is a moral to this history, it is deceptively simple. Tetanus is preventable. It is also stubborn. The disease demonstrates the power of vaccines, certainly. The toxoid transformed the epidemiological trajectory of nations, but vaccination alone is not a talisman. The larger lesson is systemic. The infrastructure of prevention matters as much as the technology. Cold chains, surveillance, skilled birth attendants, accessible clinics, roads, reliable electricity, data systems. These are the scaffolding that allows a vaccine to fulfill its promise. Research priorities follow naturally from that lesson. We must continue to improve vaccine technology, to seek formulations that are more thermostable, that require fewer doses, and that generate durable immunity with less reliance on repeated contact with formal health services. Single-visit strategies, the use of maternal immunization with highly immunogenic formulations that protect infants in the earliest vulnerable months, and operational research on timing and integration with antenatal care are all crucial. We need better serosurveillance, population studies that measure antibodies across age groups to identify immunity gaps that administrative coverage misses. We must invest in diagnostics and in methods to better capture deaths that occur outside hospitals. More rigorous verbal autopsy protocols, community death audits, and improved civil registration and vital statistics systems. In short, measurement matters. Programmatically, the strategies are straightforward but demanding. Immunization cannot be a single vertical program divorced from primary healthcare. Tetanus control succeeds when immunisation is integrated into maternal and newborn health services, when community health workers are empowered to carry vaccines and track pregnant women, when traditional birth attendants are trained and included rather than excluded, and when delivery is supported with clean instruments and clear protocols. Supplementary immunisation activities remain useful to rapidly close immunity gaps, but they must be followed by sustained routine services. Cold chain investments that Gavi and national governments have made must be maintained. Supply chains must be digitised where possible so that stockouts are visible in real time, rather than once every quarter when it is too late. The ethics of the road ahead are unavoidable. It is a shame and a structural failure that tetanus exists today, where it does because the pathogens involved are not cleverer now than they were a century ago. People simply lack the consistent, basic protections that wealthier societies take for granted. Equity must be the organising principle for the final miles. That means funding that is predictable and sustained, not episodic. It means listening to communities and co-designing interventions. It means acknowledging that coercion and shaming are not substitutes for respect and partnership. It means confronting the social determinants head-on, education for girls, infrastructure that brings clinics closer to remote communities, poverty reduction measures that make fertility births affordable. Finally, tetanus is a teacher for other global health challenges because it teaches the arithmetic of prevention. The disease is not eradicated by a one-off miracle, but by layered, ordinary measures repeated and maintained. That arithmetic translates to other campaigns: polio, measles, COVID-19 booster strategies, maternal immunisation for influenza and pertussis. The mechanics are the same: cold chains, surveillance, trust, and the politics are the same. Those who are hardest to reach are often the ones who most need the protection. The last step in eliminating tetanus as a public health problem, the lingering districts with low coverage, the refugee camps, the fragile states, will be the litmus test for global health's willingness to do the unromantic work of equity. So the road ahead is clear in its pragmatism, stubborn in its demand for system, and gentle in its requirement for humility. Invest in technology, yes, but invest also in people. Midwives who know the names of their women, health workers who will walk the dusty path to a homestead at dawn, data clerks who will keep lists accurate, logisticians who will repair a broken refrigerator at midnight. Remember the old vocabulary, lockjaw, risus sardonicus, as a warning of how language shapes fear and action, and then move beyond metaphor into measured, compassionate policy. The scourge that once bent bodies and mock-grinned at onlookers can be made rare through ordinary care applied with equity. That is not a happy ending written by fate. It is a promise that public health can keep if we do not grow tired at the last difficult mile.